Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is, well, it's perhaps the most fundamental intellectual pursuit there is, the question of a conscious creator. We are asking whether the universe, just in its structure and its operation, provides sufficient evidence or demonstrates a logical necessity that compels us to conclude it was brought into being by a supreme, intelligent being. I'll be arguing for the logical necessity and the reality of such a creator, rooted in philosophical structure and causality.
And I will be challenging those claims. I come at this from a foundational perspective that demands evidence and, just as importantly, conceptual clarity. My position is that while the concept of a creator is powerful and, historically ubiquitous, it remains an unsubstantiated hypothesis. It was developed primarily to fill the gaps in our understanding about natural phenomena. And so the claims made for a creator must meet rigorous standards of proof, and I argue they currently do not.
And that's really where our disagreement begins. My core thesis is that belief in a creator transcends just filling a knowledge gap. It's rooted in logical necessity. But first, we have to define what we even mean by a creator. This being must be the necessary existence, the entity responsible for bringing the universe from true non-existence, what we might call Adam, into reality. And so by definition, this ultimate cause has to be non-material, Gaharimadi, timeless, la zaman, and spaceless, la makan. If every material thing within the cosmos requires a cause, then the cosmos itself, and that includes all time and space, it must have an ultimate uncaused origin that exists outside of the system it created. Establishing this is, well, it's a requirement of rational thought.
Okay, but I reject the idea that we have to accept this logical bedrock just because existence is, hard to explain. My core assertion is that the default intellectual position, the most honest starting point, is the skeptical one. You can call it atheism, you can call it agnosticism, but fundamentally, it's the refusal to accept any positive claim, and the claim that a creator exists is a positive claim until conclusive objective evidence is provided. This burden of proof, it rests entirely on you, on the advocate. And historically, you're right, humans have invented gods to explain storms or disease or the complexity of life. But intellectual maturity, I think, requires us to reject those unsupported claims as our knowledge expands. Divine books, rituals, philosophical deductions, they just don't constitute the kind of objective, measurable evidence required.
I'm not entirely convinced by that framing of the default position. You're presuming that a modern sort of Enlightenment-era skepticism is the natural baseline. But if you actually analyze human civilization across millennia, from, ancient systems in India, Egypt, and Greece, all the way to contemporary cultures, the persistent central belief in a foundational deity, or at least a purposeful cosmos, that has been the historical default. We find what we call fitra, an innate spiritual inclination almost universally present. So if theistic belief is the psychological and historical norm, then the position claiming this norm is entirely illusory, well, that's the one making a new positive claim that needs substantiation. You have to explain why this deep-seated human instinct is just in error.
But that historical prevalence just demonstrates the human need for explanation and comfort. It doesn't prove the reality of the subject. Popularity is not proof. But okay, let's get to your specific requirement for a first cause. You're bringing up the cosmological argument, suggesting the material world is subject to infinite regress and therefore needs an uncaused mover to start the chain.
Exactly.
But what compels us to accept that the causal chains we observe within the universe must apply to the universe itself? I mean, scientists today are grappling with the Big Bang singularity. We have theories, quantum mechanical models, that suggest the universe could have emerged from nothing, or maybe that the whole question of before the Big Bang is meaningless because time itself began there. Why must we assume a non-material entity when physics itself seems to break down at the origin?
Because those scientific explanations, as robust as they are within the universe, they only push the problem back further. I mean, even if the Big Bang came from a quantum fluctuation, what caused the quantum field to exist in the first place and to possess the specific laws allowing that fluctuation?
The material world is, by its nature, contingent. It depends on prior conditions. So even if you accept the singularity, that point is still a contingent existence. We require a necessary being, one that doesn't depend on anything else, to initiate the whole structure. If you accept infinite regress, you never actually get to the reality we see. You need a hand that isn't itself another domino.
And this leads directly to the conceptual challenge I raised earlier, the paradox of this non-material creator. You define this creator as la zaman and la makan, timeless and spaceless.
Right.
So if the creator is entirely spaceless, how do we even conceive of its existence? I mean, is there any measurable difference between a spaceless, non-material entity that created the universe and just pure non-existence? And furthermore, the moment you talk about creation, the act of creating, you seem to reintroduce time. How does a timeless entity perform an action? Actions happen in sequence, which is time.
I understand why you raise that. It is the greatest conceptual hurdle for a finite mind trying to grasp the infinite. But we have to be very precise here. When I say the creator is timeless, it means that time is a construct of our material universe, a relationship between moving objects. The creator is outside that relationship. So asking where the creator was before creation or when the creator created, it's like imposing the rules of the creation onto the creator. It's a category error. Think of it this way. Asking where the number 0 is located in your room. It's a nonsensical question because 0 exists in the domain of mathematics, not physical space. The creator exists in a domain unconstrained by the laws it originated.
Okay, that's a clever analogy, but it ultimately sidesteps the mechanism of interaction. If the creator is purely conceptual, like a number, how does it command matter into existence? If you just say the means is a divine decree, the command be, that's just restating the premise. It's saying God created it because God said so. It doesn't actually explain the process. You're just replacing the scientific gap of how did it start with a metaphysical gap of how does an unmeasurable entity initiate reality. Both require a leap of faith, but at least the scientific gap is open to empirical study.
The fact that the mechanism is beyond our current material measurement doesn't negate the necessity of the ultimate cause. To demand a material definition of the non-material is to, well, fundamentally misunderstand the argument. But let's move from the abstract mechanism to the observable result, which I believe points powerfully towards a conscious designer. The existence of morality and the problem of evil.
Okay.
The coexistence of objective good and observable evil in our universe is, to me, strong evidence for a conscious moral setter-setter. If the universe were just the result of random, self-existent matter without consciousness, it would likely operate on a single, uniform principle. Pure randomness, maybe. The very presence of moral polarity, where we instinctively recognize injustice as objectively wrong, suggests that existence is intended as a test, an imtihan. This duality serves a purpose, giving conscious agents genuine choice.
I fundamentally disagree that observing suffering or moral behavior proves a conscious designer, and it certainly doesn't prove a benevolent one running a test. First, let's talk about objective evil. Morality is demonstrably fluid. What's considered moral is so often a product of culture and evolution. What you call an objective moral law, I see as an evolved social strategy for group cohesion. And beyond that, the suffering we see, genetic diseases, earthquakes, tsunamis, that looks far more like indifferent cosmic randomness than the refined design of a moral entity running a trial. I mean, if God created the capacity for such systemic, undeserved suffering, the design itself seems either inefficient or, frankly, morally questionable.
But if morality is entirely subjective, then a person who gets pleasure from committing a profound injustice has, by your own metric, acted morally correctly within their own frame of reference. Yet we universally condemn genocide. That universal condemnation suggests a transcendent moral standard that isn't just reducible to social programming. And regarding suffering, if the Creator intends for us to have genuine free will, that capacity must necessarily include the capacity to inflict harm and experience natural consequence. If suffering never existed, choice would be meaningless.
The creator designs the capacity for evil, the choice, but the act of evil is the human's responsibility.
You're now grappling with the ancient dilemma of God's omnipotence versus his omnibenevolence. If God is all-powerful, he could have created a universe where free will existed without the need for infant mortality or natural disasters. To say suffering is necessary for the test seems to limit God's creative power. I find the existence of such profound, undeserved suffering to be the single greatest challenge to the concept of a conscious, loving creator. Randomness explains it far better than design does.
And I reject the idea that design and process are mutually exclusive. And this actually leads us perfectly into the tension between scripture and scientific findings. You look at evolution, the 99% DNA similarity between humans and chimpanzees, and you see a direct conflict with the narratives of special creation, like Adam being formed from clay.
Exactly. If the specific narrative in Scripture about human origins, Adam from clay, Eve from a rib, is scientifically demonstrable as inaccurate, and it's contradicted by overwhelming evidence, it places the entire divine guidance into question. If the Creator cannot accurately describe the how of creation, why should we trust its authority on the why of spiritual purpose? That is the crux of the problem.
But we must carefully delineate the domains of inquiry here. Science, by definition, is tasked with investigating the process of creation, the mechanics, the genetics, the how. Religion and divine guidance are concerned with the purpose, the introduction of the spirit, moral responsibility, the why. Scripture asserts the fact of Adam's unique status as the first moral agent and prophet, but it doesn't need to provide the scientific details of the biological mechanism. If God utilized the mechanism of evolution, guided or otherwise, that doesn't negate the fact that God initiated and sustained that process. The scriptural narrative is sufficient for spiritual instruction, not for a biology textbook.
But when the scriptural narrative speaks in material terms, clay, a rib, it invites material analysis. And in those moments, it fails to align with observed reality. This forces the believer into a constant process of reinterpretation to make faith align with fact. And let's go back to your earlier point about the limits of science. You assert that science can't prove or disprove a supernatural creator because science is limited to the natural world.
That is correct. As the National Academy of Sciences itself acknowledges, the methodology of science is restricted to natural, measurable phenomena. You're using shared DNA, an observation of the material universe, to deny a being that you yourself agree must be non-material and supernatural. This is the fallacy of scientism, treating the scientific method as the only valid path to truth, even when discussing realities that fall outside of its own restricted scope.
I agree that science cannot address the supernatural, but my rejection of the Creator isn't based only on scientific findings, it's based on rationalism. If you claim a necessary, non-material being exists, yet that being has no measurable presence, no comprehensible mechanism for creation that satisfies basic logical inquiry, then the concept itself fails the test of rational coherence, regardless of whether a thermometer can measure it. The absence of conceptual clarity functions just like the absence of evidence.
And I return to the argument that demanding total logical transparency for a being that is defined as infinite is inherently contradictory. The human intellect, restricted by the time and space we inhabit, cannot fully contain the knowledge of its own origin. The fundamental arguments for a first cause, the necessity of an uncaused origin to prevent the collapse of causality, that remains the strongest intellectual anchor. We cannot abandon a logically necessary conclusion simply because the object of that conclusion transcends our limited capacity for comprehension.
The problem is that philosophical necessity remains just that, philosophical. While intellectual rigor compels us to explore the possibility of an ultimate being to explain existence, the necessity for objective evidence, or at least some definitional clarity on how this entity interacts with reality, that has not been met. I have to conclude that the concept of a creator remains a powerful, compelling yet unsubstantiated hypothesis that requires a degree of faith rather than pure evidence to accept.
And I conclude that the very structure of the material world, coupled with our shared experience of moral consequence, demands an ultimate explanation that stands outside of that material world. We must concede that our knowledge is limited, but that limitation doesn't negate the logical requirement for an ultimate cause that exists outside the system. The philosophical arguments confirm that intellectual rigor requires us to consider multiple frameworks, the necessity of existence alongside the need for empirical proof, even if total agreement remains elusive.
The complexity of this question really just confirms why the pursuit of truth requires both rational challenge and a good deal of intellectual humility.
Indeed. We acknowledge the depth of the subject and the continued value of respectful disagreement on such foundational questions. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.